You don't need me to tell you that the emergence of the internet has drastically changed just about every aspect of human life. What was once thought to be a fad that would die off any day is now permanently integrated in society and changed it forever. It made maintaining long-distance relationships with people much more manageable, school and college work is done almost exclusively online, and for the thing I'm most interested in, the many ways the internet changed the landscape of video games. The era before the internet was quite different. For starters, couch co-op was the only way to play a multiplayer game. If you needed help with something in a game, there were no guides or no tips and tricks videos on YouTube. You had to find a strategy guide and hope it had the information you were looking for. Developers didn't have an easy way of patching games with updates, so if there was a game-breaking bug, the game was stuck like that. There are so many ways gaming has changed because of the internet, sometimes for the better, and sometimes for the worse. Let's take a little trip down memory lane and see how the internet impacted gaming on a generation-by-generation basis. Attempts to get console gaming connected to the internet can date back to as early as the early 80s. The Atari 2600 and Intellivision were able to connect through a dial-up connection if you had a special cartridge or adapter. You weren't able to play multiplayer games or anything, but you were able to download games for a small fee. This feature failed to gain any traction on both of the systems, and the services were shut down in 1983 during the video game crash, which was the time the video game market was at an all-time low, and people thought video games were just a dying fad. A couple years later, Nintendo tried to get into the online business with the Family Computer Network system, which was a service for connecting your Famicom to the internet and was only released in Japan. No online multiplayer for this either, but it did allow you to access game cheats, weather reports, certain DLC, and even allowed you to access the stock trades. Imagine being set into financial ruin because you were dicking around on a Famicom. Again, it didn't achieve any mainstream success and was shut down. Sega threw their hat into the ring with the Sega MegaNet, an online service in Japan that could be accessed with a peripheral called the Mega Modem. There were plans to release it in North America under the name Telegenesis, but it never came to be. This was probably the most competent attempt so far to bring consoles online. It allowed online play and the ability to download games through special cartridges, though you had to re-download it every time you wanted to play the game. Apple stepped up to the plate in 1996 with their take on online console gaming, and they gave it their best. The Apple Pippin was released in 1996 and was the first console to have out-of-the-box online functionality via an external modem. Many people think that the OG Xbox was the first console to have this feature, and I can't really blame them. I didn't even know the Apple Pippin existed until writing the script. The console flopped hard. It launched at an astronomically high price of $599. That's over $1,100 today when you factor in inflation. It was primarily marketed as a console for surfing the web, which wasn't that appealing to people at the time, especially when you consider that price point. Overall, getting games connected to the internet during generations 3 through 5 of gaming was a pretty rocky road. Many companies saw the rise of the internet and thought that if it was going to be the next big thing, they wanted to jump on that train as soon as possible. The problem was that the internet was still in its primitive stages and the infrastructure just wasn't there. Most people didn't have access to it, and for the people that did have it, it was too slow to do anything meaningful. The best analogy I can come up with would be comparing early online gaming to the grueling efforts of getting 5G services up and running today. It's been one of the most hyped up technologies in recent years, and phones fairly recently adopted 5G modems. But it didn't mean shit because the coverage just isn't there. If you want to experience true next-gen 5G speeds, you're only really going to find it in big cities. And by true 5G speeds, I'm referring to ultra-wideband, not the sub-6 GHz 5G that shows little to no improvement over 4G. While they're currently hyping up all this amazing stuff you can do with 5G like remote surgeries, self-driving cars, and mind-melting download speeds, we're gonna be waiting a while as the infrastructure is being put into place, meaning getting more 5G nodes set up and increasing coverage. And that's what the internet looked like for gaming back in the 80s and 90s. But when we go to Gen 6 of gaming in the early 2000s, things start to get a little more interesting. This is when things really started to kick off. This was the generation of the GameCube, PlayStation 2, Sega Dreamcast, and the Xbox. The Dreamcast released on September 9th, 1999 in North America. Everyone knows the Dreamcast, home to various classics such as Sonic Adventure and Seaman. It came with a built-in modem for internet support and could be connected via a dial-up or broadband connection. It was also one of the first consoles to have an official online live service. In the US, it was called SegaNet, and in Japan, it was called Dreykus. It was a valiant effort, no doubt, but it was held back by the fact that the Dreamcast itself was a complete failure. So much so that it forced Sega to exit the console market and become a third-party game developer. Sony was up next with their legendary console, the PlayStation 2. You know, the console you were able to convince your parents to buy for you because, oh, we have to get it, it plays DVDs. Original models of the PS2 required a network adapter to play online. All versions of the network adapter came with an Ethernet port, but some came with a phone line port for dial-up connections. The PS2 Slim, released in October of 2004, didn't need one of these because it had a built-in Ethernet port. Sony didn't provide a central online service like Sega did with SegaNet. Instead, game developers had to run online games on third-party servers. The online situation on the GameCube was very similar to the PS2. It required a separate adapter and no central online service. Third parties were responsible for their own servers. The only major difference was that there weren't nearly as many games that supported online play. And that leaves us with the Xbox, another console that shipped with built-in internet support. Xbox is widely credited for pioneering online gaming as we know it. It had a broad range of games that supported online play and was the console that introduced Xbox Live, a unified online service like SegaNet that allowed for online play, a friends list, and even voice chat support. While the Xbox launched in November of 2001, Xbox Live wasn't released until the following year, in November of 2002. Online gaming played a key part in Microsoft's overall strategy with the Xbox, and this is what helped bring other consoles into the online scene. Microsoft essentially set up what would become the next big thing for gaming in the generation that followed. Generation 7 included the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and the Wii, and was the biggest leap forward for online gaming. The Xbox 360 released in 2005, while the PS3 and Wii released in 2006. At this point, it was much more common for people to have a broadband connection in their homes. With more people that had access to the internet, game companies started to go crazy with internet functionality. All three consoles launched with not only an Ethernet port, but also a Wi-Fi chip, so internet functionality was ingrained in the console's identity. All consoles had their own name for their unified online service. Xbox had Xbox Live, PlayStation had PlayStation Network, and the Wii had Nintendo Wi-Fi. Online play with the Wii and PS3 was free, and Microsoft still charged for online with the 360. But most people agreed that the online gaming ran best on the 360. Internet connectivity was finally a mainstream feature on consoles. Online multiplayer was finally in full swing. Everyone's dream of playing together with friends, even if they were hundreds of miles away, was finally becoming a reality. And even though online multiplayer was really taking off, that didn't make local multiplayer, also known as couch co-op, obsolete. All games that had multiplayer support were expected to have online and couch co-op. This was a generation where the two forms of co-op coexisted peacefully. If you wanted to play Halo with your little brother Jimmy, who's sitting right next to you, you could do that. If you wanted to play Halo with your old pal Brian, who you left behind in your home state of Idaho, you could do that. And if you really wanted to, you could even play with your little brother Jimmy sitting right next to you, and play with your old pal Brian at the same time. Generation 7 truly was multiplayer at its peak. Online multiplayer wasn't the only thing brought to your console by the internet. It also brought you online digital storefronts for downloading games. No longer did you have to beg your mom to drive you to Walmart after school so you could spend several eternities tracking down an employee so they could unchain a copy of Uncharted 2 for you, because now you could just download it in the comfort of your own home, and you didn't have to talk to a single human being. Although downloading games was more convenient, buying physical games was still the dominant way of buying games. This was because even though a lot of people had more access to the internet, they likely didn't have very fast internet. They probably looked something like my internet speeds today in 2022. The PlayStation and Xbox stores functioned exactly as you would expect. They were simply a place to download just about any game from the PS3 or Xbox 360's library, but things were quite different on the Wii. The Wii had the legendary Wii Shop channel, and it was unlike the other digital video game storefronts because it didn't have the big new releases. It wasn't a store for the latest Mario or Zelda or Metroid game. Instead, the Wii Shop channel had WiiWare, which were smaller games exclusive to the store. It also had Wii channels and, most importantly, the Virtual Console, a way of playing many different generations of Nintendo games and games from other companies as well. Digital storefronts for games were an amazing innovation for game consoles because it added a whole new level of convenience for gamers. Digital storefronts were for more than just downloading games. Later in the generation, streaming services such as Netflix, Hulu, and YouTube made their way onto the consoles. During this generation, game consoles started to feel less like game consoles and more like media devices that you could use to play DVDs or Blu-rays, stream movies and TV, and also play games if you felt like it. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It's great that your game console can do all this extra stuff. However, this caused some companies to lose focus on what the point of a game console was, but we'll talk about that in the next generation. Another innovation brought to you by the internet was the ability to patch video games. Prior to this generation of consoles, if a game had a glitch or even a game-breaking bug, it was stuck like that. There wasn't really an easy way of fixing it. Now this sounds a lot worse than it actually was. If you've played a lot of older games, you may have noticed that most of them didn't have many bugs despite the fact that patching games was nearly impossible. This is for two reasons. For one, games were just smaller and simpler back then. It was easier to test every aspect of them and make sure they were running properly. The second reason is that developers knew they only had one shot at getting it right. Releasing a game with a game-breaking bug just wasn't an option, so games were rigorously tested before being sent out to the masses. Things are obviously quite a bit different now. More and more games are being released in an unfinished state because companies can always fall back on patches to get their games running properly. In this day and age, it's totally normal to have a day one patch for your games because as soon as the game goes gold, meaning a game is complete and ready to be mass produced, developers are already back to work finishing their games so it can run how it was supposed to. I'm not trying to take a giant shit on the game developers themselves, it's more likely the higher-ups telling them that the game is fine the way it is and they can just finish it later. Patches aren't just a way for developers to fix bugs, they're also a way to add new features and content to games. This sounds like a good thing on paper, but I have some issues with it. I am not a fan of the idea of companies pushing out a game with missing content with the idea that they can just finish it later. I like all the game's content to be there from the start, even if it means it will take longer for the game to come out. I will once again be using Animal Crossing New Horizons as my punching bag here, and before I shard all over this game, I just want to say that I really do love it, it's just this one thing that I have a major issue with. The game was released with some notable key Animal Crossing features missing, such as collecting art, dreams, swimming. The roost and shopping area weren't even added until over a year and a half after the game was released. There were some other features that were added like cooking, but since they were brand new mechanics to Animal Crossing, it didn't bother me much because New Horizons already had plenty of new stuff, so it felt more like bonus content. I appreciated those types of additions. New Horizons definitely isn't the only offender of this. Nintendo Switch Sports launched without golf, kind of an important sport in a Nintendo sports game. The Last of Us Part 2 released without its famous grounded difficulty setting. Mario Golf released at a full $60 price tag, feeling half-baked and gradually added more courses and characters over time. It's really annoying to me getting a game at launch just to have it feel unfinished in terms of content and how buggy it is. Aside from it being a pain to deal with at launch, there is one other reason that this approach to developing games is an issue. It affects something that is very important to me: video game preservation. There will come a day when online services for a system will shut down. It's simply inevitable. Once those services go down, the game is stuck in its day one state. 30 years in the future, your original console that once had the update might one day decide to not boot up. Or maybe you buy a game from a used video game store and bring it home to play for the first time. There will be no way to download the update that gives you the missing features and squashes the bugs. New Horizons won't have swimming, Cyberpunk 2077 will continue to run like ass, and it will be a dark day. And that just blows! I want to know the games that I have on my shelf will forever be complete and run smoothly, but I know that's not the case because one day in the event that my console breaks and I have to get a new one, I'll have no way of updating my games and Skyward Sword will be stuck with a game-breaking bug. I think the ability to patch games and hardware is a wonderful feature. Accidents do happen and software will always have bugs, so it's great to have the software updates as a safety net for those little mishaps. You also have to consider that games are grander in scale and more complicated these days. This isn't Pong and Dig Dug anymore, this is Red Dead Redemption 2 and Breath of the Wild. I'm not expecting these games to run absolutely flawlessly, and updates help squash the little bugs that are bound to happen. However, a lot of companies abuse this feature and like to push out unpolished, incomplete games with the mindset of, oh, we can just finish the game after launch, that way we can get the game in the hands of consumers sooner. No! That is the wrong way to develop games! And unfortunately, the bar keeps getting lower and lower as more and more games from big, reputable companies release games at a worse and worse state. It is not unreasonable to want games to be functional and complete at launch. The Last of Us Part 2, one of the most technically advanced games to date, released running almost perfectly with no noticeable frame drops, no game-breaking bugs, no soft locking, and very few graphical glitches. If they can make it happen, so can others. Some games just need a little bit more time in the oven, that's all. I don't mind waiting for a more polished experience, but that's just me. I won't speak for everybody on this. And that covers Gen 7. Generation 8 was the dawn of the PS4, Xbox One, the Wii U, and kinda the Nintendo Switch. It's not exactly clear what Nintendo console is a part of what generation because the release dates are so weird. The Wii U released on November 18th, 2012, the PS4 released on November 15th, 2013, the Xbox released on November 22nd, 2013, and the Nintendo Switch released on March 3rd, 2017. Again, no one can really decide which generation the Switch was a part of. The internet just kept on trucking this generation. One of the biggest changes this generation was the demise of local multiplayer or couch co-op. Couch co-op has been a thing since video games have been a thing. All generations of consoles prior to this point had couch co-op. Even in the previous generation when online gaming became mainstream, all games were still expected to have a local multiplayer mode. This generation, online multiplayer took over, and for reasons uncertain, local multiplayer fizzled out. It wasn't completely gone, but it wasn't guaranteed that your multiplayer game would have it. Overwatch and Halo, for example, only have online modes. One reason could simply be that online gaming is the way of the future. It's more convenient, you don't have to leave your basement to go to someone's house, and you don't have to worry about your mom yelling at you to clean the house before you have friends over. You and your bros can just play together from the comfort of your own homes. Most people may have just started to prefer online multiplayer to local multiplayer. Even if this is the case, I don't really understand the point of omitting the option to have local multiplayer. It's not gonna hurt anything, and it's nice for the people who want it even if they're the minority, right? Well, another reason for the demise of couch co-op could be that developers don't want to have to worry about working around the power constraints of the console. As soon as interest around gaming online increased, many developers likely jumped at the chance to ditch local multiplayer because having more people play on a single console is more taxing on the system's hardware. Take Mario Kart for example. When you're playing on your own or online, the game runs at a buttery smooth 60 frames per second. But as soon as you get that local multiplayer split screen going, the frame rate is chopped in half because the game now has to have 4 cameras running on 4 different players at once. When you're playing online, everyone has their own system and it isn't as power consuming. Developers can then focus on making their games as technically advanced as possible without having to account for local multiplayer. There is one other reason I think developers may have mostly abandoned couch co-op, and I think it's the most substantial reason of all. It is the result of the most powerful force on the planet: money. With local multiplayer, the only extra thing you need is a few extra controllers. With online multiplayer, you need 2 consoles, 2 copies of the game, 2 online subscriptions, and sometimes both players will want a season pass or something. Online gaming is more financially beneficial for companies, so it's no wonder many of them abandoned the couch co-op ship as soon as they could. Also, when I say companies have been phasing out local multiplayer this generation, I'm talking about every company other than Nintendo. Nintendo to this day still offers local multiplayer on its system. Lucky for us, Nintendo is still trying to figure out what the internet is, so they will likely continue to support couch co-op for a very, very long time. So, the internet killed about 67% of couch co-op. What else did it do? You know how earlier I mentioned that some companies lost focus on what the point of a game console was because of streaming? Well, I was talking about Microsoft here. When the Xbox One was unveiled for the first time, they tried to market it as an all-in-one media box for your living room. Instead of focusing on it being a powerful console capable of playing an awesome library of games, they were all like, "Oh look, it's Netflix, isn't that neat?" They also revealed that the Xbox had to be connected to the internet at all times in order to function, which is just a horrendous idea. If you live in the middle of dipshit nowhere like me, you know that this console just isn't going to be an option for you. It's for reasons like this that the Xbox One didn't perform so hot compared to the PS4. But anyway, what else did the internet do this generation? DLC became more of a standard this generation. DLC, or downloadable content, is bonus content you can download for your game after launch. It can be anything as small as cosmetics to adding entire new levels, campaigns, and maps to your game. DLC can technically be free. For example, the new courses and characters added to Mario Golf Super Rush after launch were referred to as DLC, but people usually think of paid DLC when it's brought up. DLC was technically a thing in past generations, but it wasn't until this gen that it would become more common. Whenever a new game was released this gen, people would immediately wonder if there would be DLC for it. Because of the rise of DLC, gamers across the globe began to question the morality of it. The critics of DLC will say that it's a way of locking content that should have been in the game to begin with behind what is usually a $20 to $30 paywall, while people on the other side of the fence will say that paying for DLC is always optional, and it's a way of providing more content for a game without the need to do a full-blown, fully priced sequel. Both sides have their own merit, but I and many others believe that, like most other arguments, the answer lies somewhere in the middle. There are plenty of examples of DLC done in a way that doesn't feel sleazy. Take Pokemon Sword and Shield for example. Pokemon is notorious for doing quote-unquote sequels or third entries to their games that are fully priced and add very little content and make you wonder if it was even worth the money in the first place. They were able to reprimand this with Sword and Shield by adding DLC to the games for a $30 price tag, instead of doing a Sword and Shield 2 with a big fat $60 price tag. This DLC just sat right with me. It also felt like bonus content instead of stuff that should have been in the game to begin with. On the flip side, you have companies locking content behind a DLC paywall that could have easily been in the main game. I don't have too many personal experiences to draw from here, because if I don't think a DLC will be worth it, I simply don't buy it. The only time I can think of that I felt robbed was in Smash 4, when I was paying $6 each for characters that have already been in the Smash series, but were then suddenly being tied to DLC, such as Mewtwo and Lucas. Characters like Cloud made sense. He has never been in Smash until that point, and considering he's a third-party character, I'd imagine it's a lot of work to get him in the game because of licensing and stuff. But could Lucas really not make it in the main game? The Smash 4 example is pretty tame compared to what other companies are doing. I usually never consider Nintendo having malicious intentions or anything. Like I said before, Nintendo to this day is still trying to understand the internet, so stuff like this usually just comes off as ignorance. And then you have other companies that would literally lock true endings of games behind paid DLC. The game Asura's Wrath, published by Capcom, infamously did this exact thing by locking the real ending to the story behind a $7 paywall. This is obviously not good. You can't just force players to pay for essential story content. Imagine if you had to pay for the death of Arthur Morgan. DLC is a bit of a mixed bag overall. Here are some other random things that grew this gen. Live streaming became more of a thing this gen thanks to the rise of Twitch. That alongside the growing platform of YouTube meant that playing video games for a living was starting to become a reality, so long as you had the skills to entertain and the perseverance to grow a community. Video game presentations started to transition to all digital events, with Nintendo, of all companies, leading the wave with Nintendo Directs. Not only did they forego traditional in-person E3 events for live streams, they also host them periodically throughout the year and are some of the most hyped up gaming events ever. Sony eventually followed suit with their take on Nintendo Directs called State of Play. Today, even individual game developers like Capcom host their own digital events for their specific games. With the internet growing, it feels like we're constantly being fed new gaming news. And that covers most of the changes the internet caused in Generation 8. And finally, we arrive at the current generation of consoles, which began at the end of 2020 with the launch of the PS5 and the Xbox Series S and X. I guess the Switch is technically a part of this generation, since it's Nintendo's latest console. To be honest, not too many new things emerged because of the internet's continued growth compared to other generations, though this is probably because we're only a little over 2 years into this generation. There's 3 main things I can think of. The first is that digital-only consoles started to rise in popularity. Both Sony and Microsoft offered digital-only consoles with the Xbox Series S and the appropriately named PS5 Digital Edition. This shows how much more popular it is at this point to download games digitally versus getting a physical copy. Nowadays, some people are so sure that they will never buy a physical game that they are perfectly willing to get a console without a disc drive to save a couple bucks. Another thing I can think of that started to become more popular this generation is video game subscription services such as Xbox Game Pass and PS Now. Basically, you pay a monthly fee to get access to a large library of games, like a video game version of Netflix. These services technically existed last generation, but I don't think they really started gaining traction until around this generation, especially Game Pass. You get a lot of games for what you pay for these days, and the library just keeps on growing as Microsoft acquires more studios. Some games you can even play the day they're released, such as the recently released High on Life. It's really awesome. The last thing that started appearing more late last gen, early this gen is cloud gaming. As you might be able to tell by the music choice, cloud gaming is kinda bad right now. Cloud gaming is the idea that you can play any video game on pretty much any device with a screen because the device itself isn't doing any of the processing. A much more powerful machine is doing all the processing somewhere else in the world, and it is then being streamed to your screen via the internet. On paper, this sounds really cool. You don't need a super powerful machine to run a game with beautiful graphics, and if you have a fast enough connection, you can run it at super high frame rates and resolutions. All you really need is a controller and a TV or something to stream it to. It sounds cool, but why are so many people against it? If we're being honest here, I think one of the biggest reasons people are so reluctant to hop on this cloud gaming future is because being able to do this is kind of a spit in the face to people who spent over $2,000 on a gaming PC setup. It's also a spit in the face to people like me who care a lot about video game preservation and like collecting physical games. Lastly, cloud gaming is in a very rocky state right now. It's still in its infancy. There's very noticeable input lag on almost all the services, and a lot of people don't have a fast enough internet to run the service properly and make it worth it in the first place. Things are going so poorly right now that Google is shutting down its cloud gaming service, Google Stadia, in January of 2023. It is not replacing traditional gaming anytime soon in the near future, but I do think it's inevitable. People will always choose what is more convenient for them, and as sad as it may be, It's hard for me to imagine the future generations of gamers passing up on it once the services have become advanced enough.